was 2 months ago when I got the news. The moment I saw the caller ID, my skin turned cold and my bones became weak. Lakewood Medical Center emergency room. I left the warehouse and headed straight there, wasting no time. She was still alive when I got the call, but just barely. It didn't matter. She passed before I got to the front door. It was 2 months ago that my wife, Amber, died. She was 6 months pregnant with our Rose. We were expecting an angel, a light to bring to our everyday lives. We moved into the area for our child, both deciding where we wanted to start our lives as a family. She wanted a blue house. I wanted something by the mountains. We picked the perfect combination of the two. I collapsed on the ground when I heard what had happened. The doctor assured me her death was quick and painless, and that they had done everything to save her and our child. The other driver died in the collision as well, and it was immediately obvious that it was the act of a drunk driver. I sat motionless in the room for hours, drying eyes staring at the clinical lights as I tried to hold myself from shaking to death. It was 2 months ago that I first saw it. As bright as the patient room was, there was a thin growth of shadow starting along the side of the otherwise pristine walls, small filaments creeping along the interior in a twisted but intelligent manner. It looked like a growth of mold, something a tad unnatural, but I really wasn't in the mindset to question anything. With tear-soaked eyes, I watched it slowly grow, but convinced myself it was a grief-driven hallucination. And if it wasn't, well, I didn't really give a fuck. The weeks following have been cold, forgettable, quick. I barely remember the funeral. My eulogy was short. I couldn't say many words without breaking apart. Her family kept to themselves, and I was left to burden my own sorrow. I left the funeral home having provided only one real message. I loved her. Everywhere I went, every room I entered, it was there, a spindly, shadowy chute, climbing up along the walls, sometimes hidden under a table or behind curtains. There was only one constant. It was growing, albeit very slowly. I didn't give it any attention. It didn't deserve my recognition, not when my entire world had been so effortlessly ripped from me. Weeks passed. I lost my job. The house became my prison. The world was impartial to my grief, so I became impartial to it. I really didn't need to leave. I had savings for months. I welcomed the comforting coldness of independence while I reconciled with what happened. I took up smoking, then promised I'd quit. Then I took up smoking again. The phone would ring, but nobody would answer. I was turned off. I wasn't a man, but a ghoul living in a tired body. I spent my nights in front of the television, fake light bouncing off my dreary face and into the void. I almost always had a cigarette in my hand, choosing the reality where everything was dizzy and sick over the one where I had to confront the looming darkness of the shadow that kept me company. This shadow was growing and growing and growing and growing. I thought I could see roots and the small shoots of leaves forming along the shadowy figure. I had begun to feel a bit disconcerted with its presence, but I was in a maze of grief. Still, I was unsure if it was possible to hallucinate something so intricate for so long. This thing had followed me everywhere, always getting bigger and always present. I hid my uneasiness behind liquor. I drank every night until I fell asleep, stringing up the same dreams of a peaceful blue house by the mountain where Amber was still alive, still my wife, and I had a child yet to welcome to this world. Last night, I had the same dream. I was alive again, greeted by the warm smile and calm demeanor of a woman who I had promised my life to. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, and I could hear the sizzling of a pan. I wasn't sure what she was cooking this time. Dreams are weird like that, but I remember approaching her from behind, nestling my chin into her shoulder as I closed my eyes. She laughed. I told her how much I missed her, and she told me she knew. It was strange how vivid this dream had been. I could recount most of the details, and it was painfully peaceful. We ate together, watched a movie together, held each other. "You've got a visitor." I was startled. She spoke clearly and crisply. I turned to look her in her eyes, my voice calm but muddled. "A visitor? You can't stay long," she said. "You've got something to tend to." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm staying here as long as I can." "I'm serious." I tilted my head, now a wave of bewilderment washing over me. "Who would visit me now?" She didn't answer, instead smiling faintly and saying a meager few words. "Be safe." The dream tore her away from me, and I awoke, laying in my bed, my face sweaty as I bolted upwards, staring into the darkness of my house. I was in my empty house again. I let my eyes adjust to the lower pitch, rubbing the crust out from under my eyelids. Outside, I could hear lightning flashing from a heavy storm, thunder crackling across the sky. It was the same room I had come to loathe. I sat on my side of the bed, her side filled with belongings of hers I had yet the heart to dispose of. The floor was littered with dirty clothes, my old work uniform, and bottles. The drawers were haphazardly opened, no longer sorted, and the television sat adjacent to the dark figure standing by my bathroom door. I jumped out of my skin. There was someone standing at the end of my room. As soon as it noticed I was awake, it moved. I shrilled, throwing the covers over my mouth as I watched wide-eyed in panic. The figure shambled forward, coming to the edge of my bed before speaking in a dry, raspy voice that could almost be mistaken as wheezing. "Mr. Cutler," it said, his words sending an icy chill down my back. That's when my eyes fully adjusted to the darkness that surrounded us. The figure before me was dressed as a priest. His robe, stained dark with the dried blood, and his abdomen was punctured by twigs and sharp thorns. Small black barbs lined the wood that stabbed out from him, and they were rustling violently as he stood, motionless. His skin was wrought and pale. His eyes had been replaced by a dark and violently twisted bark. Branches plunging out and back into his skin, his entire body was adorned with scratches and open gushes, yet he paid very little mind to his condition. He only stared at me with missing eyes. I moved myself as close to the wall as I could as the figure stepped my way. I screamed, retracting my legs and arms as close to my chest as I could as my eyes focused on the man in front of me. "Mr. Cutler," he said again, his mouth struggling to open and close. "You've been visited by the tree." My mouth was agape as I closed my hands into fist. The rustling of the barbs on him was acutely audible, and they grew more violently as the figure stepped even closer. His breathing was labored heavily, as if he was fighting for his right to breathe. "What?" "I wish you no harm, Mr. Cutler." He brought himself to the edge of the bed, the outlines of the branches at a stark contrast to his pale figure. He sat down, turning achingly slow to face me. "I am simply here by my master's will." The man before me should have been dead. I could make no mistake about that. He was punctured at least a dozen times over and repenetrated in areas that should kill him. He was enveloped in a twisted and evil growth, and it looked like he became the host to a carnivorous abomination. Your master?" I stammered. Words barely came out. I spoke shallowly, yet somehow the corpse priest heard me. "Yes, and it's rather displeased with you." "Why?" I turned back towards the door as he brought his body back to a weak stand. "Would you like to come with me? Will you kill me if I don't?" "As I told you, Mr. Cutler," he said, beginning to slide his way towards the hallway door. "I wish you no harm." By some miracle, I could feel my nerves soften as I heard the calm in his voice. I was most certainly experiencing something otherworldly, and I knew I was no longer in a dream. No, everything I was witnessing and experiencing was undoubtedly real. I could feel the sweat dripping from my forehead onto my trembling hands. The air had turned frigid, my eyes were dry, and the room was exactly how I left it before I fell asleep, save for this unknown intruder. I spent another minute huddled against the wall before swinging my legs slowly over the bed and nodding my trembling head. "Very good," he said, the corners of his mouth drooping as he pushed these words out. He turned a blank eye socket towards me, before heading his way to the hallway past my door. "My master is dissatisfied with you because you have chosen to ignore her." "I've been ignoring a lot of people," I said. We started towards the door. I walked a good distance behind the shambling man that now guided us into the dark. "Have you noticed the shadows creeping up your wall? Notice how it follows you wherever you go?" I nodded, staying silent. "Then you've already met my master. At least, you've had a brief introduction." We passed the nursery at this point, my heart pounding as I clenched my hands. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, grief filling me again as I glanced at the nursery door. I hadn't opened it in months, and have tried to ignore its presence since the accident. I knew what was inside, an empty crib and boxes full of clothes we had bought for Rose. The figure turned to face me and spoke. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice barely soothing. "But we must continue." The house was frigid, and I began to shiver as the temperature began to drop drastically as we approached the stairs. "What does your master want with me?" "She wants to save you, Mr. Cutler. Revive you." His voice was clear, if low and scratchy. We made it to the stairs, and I could see the shape even in the abject darkness as we began to descend. A large, imposing plant had engulfed the far side of my kitchen. Dark red leaves protruded from sharp barbs, and repulsive flowers dotted the sides of the massive tree. I could hear rustling in the darkness. I could only surmise that along this tree were thousands of barbs that had become aware of my presence, now shaking violently. My heart was erupting, my legs shaking, and I held my hand over my mouth and nose to cover the stench of rotting flesh coming from the center of the room. The priest slowly turned to me, his colorless expression and bloody face doing nothing to offer me comfort. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I shook my head no. That's not real, is it?" "It's more real than you or I. We merely live in its shadow." He winced in pain, a pool of blood showing up in the center of his robe before a small shoot poked through, then stopped. I let out a yelp when the shoot turned towards me, the shape of a twig resembling that of a tooth. He clenched his chest, gathered himself, then started speaking again. "Would you like to meet her formally?" "I think I'm going to pass on your offer," I said, my voice stumbling as he walked down to the kitchen and towards the abomination. "Please, Mr. Cutler, I assure you that it is as harmless as I. It just wants to open your eyes to the true form and have you join its servitude. This isn't a process that's negotiable." His voice rose louder than before, and he spoke with an intent I had yet heard from him. "That's precisely why it sent me here." He motioned for me to join him at the edge of the tree. I gripped the railing of the stairs, my knees wobbling as my eyes scanned the scene before me. I descended and warily made my way to the priest, grabbing a steak knife on a nearby counter just to be safe. "Reach out your hand and touch it," he said. This close to the tree, I could see my breath as I shivered and it shook violently. I looked at the bloody protrusions coming from the man's body. "You sure it's peaceful?" The priest looked back with empty sockets, nodding his head. The barbs on the tree violently shook, and the flowers that dotted the wood were opening and closing, turning slightly as if to follow my hand as I slowly reached out. If I knew any better, I'd say it looked as if the plant was salivating. I don't think. A vine shot out of the dark, quickly twisting its way around my arm. I hollered as I could feel the barbs penetrate my skin, the vine squeezing as I viciously pulled away with all the strength I had. The priest spectated in moderate interest as the tree began to pull me towards it, flowers opening up and revealing hundreds of teeth. I screamed. I screamed louder than I ever have, my free hand gripping the steak knife, intense pain flaring up my arm. I swung the knife to the vine, cutting it until the tree pulled back, releasing me. I stumbled backwards into the table, knocking over a chair as I landed on the floor. I scurried to the edge of the furthest wall, my breathing wild as blood spurt from the new holes along my arm. I gripped my hand, clenching my teeth as I watched my arm turn red. What the fuck was that? I screamed between panic breaths. You said it was harmless. It is a new experience you have yet had the pleasure of facing, he said. The first time is always the roughest. I watched him as he outstretched his hand to the tree, a small vine slithering from its bark and up his arm before burrowing under his skin. He pulled his arm back, a feeling of intense pain splashing on his face before he returned to normalcy. I want you and your stupid plant to leave, I said. We won't be doing that. You are filled with so much grief, so much pain. We shouldn't let that go to waste. I'm calling the authorities then, I said, stammering up, still gripping the steak knife. I hadn't really considered that even if I did, there wouldn't be anything they could do. You can call the police, and you can run, but it is futile. The tree is only visible to those it seeks, and it seeks only you. It lives under you and I, and has forever. Under every person who has ever lived or ever will, the tree waits dormant. Most are not lucky enough to warrant a visit. It is selective, but it can never be outran, so please, Mr. Cutler, let's stop wasting time. He cried out as the branches under his skin twisted, forming new holes in his torso and contorting his limbs. Then he let out a blood-curdling scream as the tree racked his body, bringing him to the ground, spinning and rolling before he regained control. Moments passed, and he slowly looked back upright as if nothing had happened, his body now covered in disgusting growths. It's using you, I said through seething teeth. You're letting it, and it's eating you alive. That is such a primitive way of looking at it. His voice boomed across the house, and I began to feel goosebumps grow on my skin. The pain in my arm flared, and the tree began to creep further along the walls of the kitchen, branches extending over the back door. I turned to where the front of the house was, small twigs now blocking the exit. The priest made his way to me, holding an outstretched hand, the barbs whistling at me as he came closer. I stood further back. You must understand, it only wants to give you a new purpose. I mumbled, fear overtaking me again as I refused to look at the figure standing before me. And what has it done for you? It saved me as I died. I spent my last weeks running from it, very much like you are, but I could never get away. And so in my dying breaths, no longer able to escape, I embraced it. It has burdened me with the truth of our world and the world beyond and the world of the true form, and now I act as its agent so that others may see the light as I have. I began to stand, inching closer to the staircase. So that's it then? You let it kill you? It didn't kill me. It gave me new life. No, I died because of something far more mundane. He turned to me with empty sockets, a new darkness filling his gaze. Before he spoke, I could feel my heart accelerate and my body stiffen as my fear was turning into something far more primal. He coughed up blood and glass before speaking again. The cause of my death was an automobile accident. I felt the temperature of the room rise from the dreary cold I was now beginning to grow used to. In the back, the tree was beginning to grow again. A car accident? Precisely that. At that point, his grin became deep and his eye sockets grew darker as he poised himself to confront me directly. Now, Mr. Cutler, would you like to know on which intersection? No. I could feel my skin rise, my hair straightening out, and my blood begin to boil. My mind drifted off to Amber, to the news the doctors gave me, the night spent in the hospital. Tears welled in my eyes as the tree grew. No, it was on East Meridian and 12th Avenue. Stop talking. I could hear the rustling of the damn tree as the branches began to expand and the walls exploded with thin growth. I stood straight, ignoring the pain in my arm as I stood to face the figure before me, gripping the knife in my hand. I saw the other vehicle coming. It was a yellow sedan, wasn't it? I don't remember the exact details. I was quite drunk. I screamed as a fist cut through the air and landed in the center of the bastard's face. He stumbled back and I brought another blow to the other side, the force causing him to meagerly shamble closer to the tree. He laughed, the needles hissing in a vicious cacophony. She works in mysterious ways, wouldn't you agree? But alas, it's just a faint stroke of paint in a larger frame. Tears dripped away from my face as the rustling of the tree grew in intensity. I stood in the dark house, alone and cut off from the world as I began to realize what I had done. The tree had grown substantially, its branches beginning to poke away from the walls and the kitchen all but enveloped. The walls of my house were becoming a mess of vines, barbs, and branches, and the flowers were all pointing towards me, opening and closing like salivating mouths. The priest smiled, and I glared at him with bloodshot eyes. You killed my family. You took my child's future away. You took everything I lived for. No, Mr. Cutler, I haven't taken everything from you. He stepped forward, branches of the tree following him as he stepped my way. Not yet anyways, but I will, and it'll be for your own good. You will embrace the tree. Fuck your tree. Vines snaked around his ankles, extending across the floor like a dark labyrinth. Do you know what she said in her dying breaths? She kept calling out your name. Now, you should understand that speaking with a punctured lung is very difficult, but she did try. I could feel my legs wobble as my body grew weak. I stammered towards the stairs, turning away from the tree and the priest, my back exposed. And your daughter was going to be a fantastic doctor. She would have saved so many lives. I fell to the wall, my bloody arm feeling loose. I could hear the tree approaching. Please, I sobbed. I don't want any of this. You would have had a son as well, he said. Would you like to know more about him? The tree erupted as I was plunged into a wave of grief. The priest stood, his broken arms outstretched. I held the knife in my hand, turning quickly and placing it in his chest. I was close to the corpse's face, his missing eyes peering into my soul. Blood trickled down from where the knife stabbed him. He smiled, grabbing my hands. I hollered as I could feel barbs penetrate my palms. I writhed and tried to pull away, but he gripped tightly. The branches protruding from the wall slowly closed the gap to me. Think about the day you lost them. Think about the miserable and alone you were at the funeral. Remember how weak it made you. Let the tree grow. Let them be your martyrs. The flowers began to open, and tendrils with sharp teeth like appendages began to emerge. The priest opened his mouth, his bottom jaw cracking as a large vine slithered from his throat. He moaned in intense pain, and for a brief moment his grip softened. I pulled my arms from the barbs, my skin shearing as they tried to regain grasp. I stumbled back as he fell to his knees, shaking violently as the bloody vine grew from his mouth and onto the floor, snaking its way towards me. For a brief second, I could see panic in his demeanor, and he reached out as if he was begging for me to end his suffering. I had very little sympathy for this man. My hands had become a mess, deep lashes oozing dark blood that fell to the floor. The pain was near unbearable, and I held the bloody stumps toward my chest as I shambled up the stairs. Flashes of lightning outside were muddled by the oppressive growling of the tree. Vines snapped at my ankles as I leapt toward the hallway, blood oozing onto my shirt. I pressed my body against the wall, branches slithering into the hall from my bedroom. I turned behind to see the priest crawling up the steps, the vine wailing in the air as it was trying to grip onto me. I thought I could hear him begging for help. I was surrounded. There was only one way to go. I turned towards the nursery, pain flaring through my hands as I gripped the door, turned the lock, and fell through. The room had been so far untouched. The walls were a bright pink, and it was mostly empty save for a crib and a box of clothes that we brought to prepare for the child. I slammed the door behind me, slumping against the frame as I heard the rustling encroach behind me. Something large bumped into the door, and I felt it bulge against my back. I yelped as I heard the wheezing of the priest as he slammed his body into the door. I gripped the frame, pushing myself against the crib with the force of my whole body, closing my eyes as I could feel the encroaching darkness suffocating me. I was ready to escape this nightmare. I thought of our last week. I thought of our last month. The banging on the door was intensifying, and I could hear small vines coming over the top of the door. I thought of the day that we painted the nursery. It was the same day that I promised Amber I would quit smoking forever. I faintly remember the smell of paint, the bright sun, and the shared optimism we had. I handed her my lighter, telling her I was officially clean and that our child would breathe clean air. The door was busting on the edge. The rustling was deafening. "I'm going to join you," I said. She looked up at me, a look of confusion on her face. "What about your own life?" I shook my head. "I'm afraid it's over." The house in this dream was bright and warm as I remembered it. We danced momentarily like that day that we painted the nursery. I held her tightly as she gripped my torso. Then, she pulled herself towards me, whispering with a faint sadness in her voice. "You can't let it win." I trembled. I could hear my own screams coming from somewhere behind me, struggling against a door that was ready to give in at any moment. "There's nothing I can do." She pulled away, and I could see the look in her eye. "If you let it consume you, then this would be the last we ever see each other." She pulled the lighter out of her pocket, putting it in my palm. "Please, what? It's time to move on," she said. She hugged me one last time. I weakly reciprocated. "I don't know if I can." I stood motionless, waiting for an affirming word, or something telling me that I didn't need to go through with this. When I didn't get one, I nodded. Instead, I could only mutter one word. "Okay. We'll always be here waiting. I promise." My eyes tore open as the door busted open against the weight of the tree. I stood back in the nursery, staring into the maw of darkness as it crept forward. My despair turned to anger as I clenched my fist. At the forefront was the priest. He held his hand out and spoke again. "It's time to come with us," he said. There was something metal in my left hand. I opened it, looking at the small lighter I had tossed months ago, yet now here it was. I could feel the weight in my heart lift as the tree grew into the room, the walls and the ceiling becoming victims to its might. I turned toward the crib, and with a hissing shrill I pulled one of the boards from it, ignoring the scathing pain in my arms. The vines were beginning to descend from the ceiling, sharp tendrils lined with teeth and barbs. I kept my head low as I ripped open the boxes with my fingers, grabbing the clothes we had stored. I tied as much as I could around the end of the board, working as hastily as I could with trembling fingers. Once I had the makeshift torch in hand, I gave one last look at the priest, then flicked the lighter on. He winced as his abdomen sprang open with vines, and I lit the torch. My blood boiled as I ran into the edge of the room, the fire growing in intensity as the tree enveloped me in its twigs. I twisted my foot, tossing the torch into the darkness. The vines grabbed at me, and I could do very little but cry out as the fire flared in the hallway. The priest hissed, and the tree stopped moving for a moment. The vines started to flail as the abomination caught fire, and my house was filled with a horrifying shrieking. I pulled my arms from the now weak tendrils. The priest shrieked, his clothes catching fire as his skin began to crisp. Cutler, what the hell do you think you're doing? He retreated into the hallway, tumbling down the stairs as the rest of the house began to envelop in flame. The tree continued to shrivel and twist away in defiance, the smoke clogging the air, the sound of wood popping and sparks flying. Outside, I could hear the lightning intensify as I got up from the nursery floor, covering my mouth with shredded arms. For once, the tree ignored me as I made my way to the hallway, faltering down the stairs. I knocked into pictures hanging from the wall, their frames coming to the ground as the frame of the house gave in to the flames. Pictures of me and Amber burned behind me as I continued to look forward, my feet giving away as I fell to the lobby of the house. I pressed myself up, watching as the ceiling erupted into a bright red and orange light. The tree retreated back into the corner, and I was left alone inside of the burning house. Behind me, the door was kicked open, and I could hear heavy footsteps as arms came up from behind me. My feet dragged behind as I was pulled away from the fire. I struggled to my feet when we made it to the patio, letting the firefighters carry me as my vision blurred. When my vision became less fuzzy, I found myself sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, ash smeared across my face and arm, sitting still under a warm blanket. A firefighter walked up to me, his helmet brought to his chest. Was there anyone else with you inside? I turned to the burning entrance, the dark shape of a contorted figure staring at me from the flame. I saw branches poking from his body, and he stood motionless for a few moments before turning into the fire, engulfing himself in the flame. I shook my head no. A paramedic stood in front of me, a flashlight shining into my face. I watched as the blue house by the mountain withered away, burning its ashes, escaping into the night. My arms were lifted, the paramedics commenting on the mangled skin and deep lashes. They asked me if I knew what had happened. I told them I had no recollection. The last thing I remember from that night was the ambulance driver telling me everything was going to be okay. I nodded, and for the first time in months, I smiled. Well, that was a page turner. That was fun. Dealing with grief, loss, blaming yourself. Be a hell of a thing. Fortunately, this guy survived. What'd you guys think? If you did enjoy it, much like I did enjoy reading it, leave me a like, a subscribe, comment, interact with me. Let me know I'm doing a pretty good job and I can keep this going for you. Until then, until next time, this has been Hero's Edge.